Hi everyone, today I'm going to be talking about wickless testing and whether or not it is a good or better alternative method to testing your candles to save you time, money, and so on. For those that have been following me for quite some time, you know that I like to follow a logical, almost scientific type of process with nearly everything that I do and every decision that I make. Well, today is no exception, and I'm going to be breaking down my analysis of wickless testing as a suitable alternative in a few different categories. We're going to start with the what, which is what is the problem we're trying to solve. Next is the proposed solution of wickless testing. Next, I'm going to talk about both the pros and the cons of the said solution of wickless testing. And then finally, we're going to wrap this up with conclusions and my overall recommendations and thoughts about this testing method. Introduction over, let's go ahead and get started. Cue random transition. Hi everyone, I am Wade from Black Tie Barn Candle Company and the Black Tie Barn Workshop. On this channel, we talk about candle making, candle business, and really anything related to that industry. If you are new to this channel, please give this video a like by hitting the thumbs up button below, and also consider subscribing below as well if you're interested in any of that type of content. And don't forget to hit that little bell icon to turn on notifications, so that way whenever I post new videos, YouTube makes sure to let you know. Otherwise, you may not even know I posted anything. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. First, we're going to talk about what problem are we trying to solve by considering the use of wickless testing. Most of us know by now that testing is expensive. It costs a lot of money to test jars and wax and different fragrance oils. Every candle that we make is more expense to us, but it's also more product waste. And so if you are just starting out, testing is usually the most expensive and the most timely part of the process. And you're also typically working with less inventory on hand, and every time you have to eat into that inventory to do testing, that really can be a setback. The problems are clear, and again, testing is expensive. Fragrance oils are not cheap, and wax is not cheap, especially if you have to have it shipped to you because your supplier is not local or within driving distance. And with your typical kind of standard testing process, you would make several candles and each one would have a different wick or different size of wick. And after you do several test burns, you would choose the one that you think was the best overall burn. In fact, you might choose two. If two are really good, you might have a backup as well. In fact, that is something I always like to do with my candles, is make sure I have a backup solution to every candle, whether that's a jar or a wick. I do this for several reasons, but as many of us have experienced this year, supply shortages and supply chain issues are a real thing. It's one of the reasons I like to have backup options. I talked about that in a most recent video, which I will link above. But beyond that, the main problem here that we're trying to solve is the expense and waste of testing. Now, I would argue that it's a necessary cost of doing business. That's my personal opinion on that. While it might be a necessary cost of doing business, it's also a tough pill to swallow when you're first getting started. So I completely understand that, but without any question, cost and waste of materials is a real problem that many candle makers are trying to solve, or at least try to increase efficiencies to handle. So if that is the problem, what is the proposed solution? Well, as you know, this video is talking about wickless testing. For those of you real quick that are not familiar with what wickless testing is, it's basically where you make a candle with no wick, and you're going to insert the wick later once the candle is completely cooled. Now, the way you're going to do that typically is you're going to take a skewer. Some people have used screwdrivers, really anything that you can insert to your candle and poke a hole straight down the middle. You're going to use that space to insert your wick later. So why would you do that? Well, the idea here is you insert a wick, and if the wick doesn't really work out, you tell really early on that it's way too big or way too small, or maybe the wrong type entirely. You can simply remove the wick with a pair of needle nose pliers or something like that, and then you can go back and insert another wick to try again. That all sounds great in theory, and there are some real advantages to doing that, which we're going to talk about in the next section. But how does that contrast to what you would typically do? As I mentioned, normally you would make maybe 4 or 6 different testers, each one of those testers being a full complete candle with their own wick. As you can see, if you've made 4 testers compared to your one, you've already used 4 times as many materials and 4 times the cost of materials as well. So with wickless testing, you only had to make the one candle and you just swap out different wicks as needed. Now, I should mention real quick, many people have asked what you do with wooden wicks. Can you do the same thing? Well, yes, you can do the same process with a wooden wicks, but in my opinion, it is not necessary. The reason why is with a wooden wick, they have tabs, and wooden wicks actually just slip into those tabs, right? They're not permanently connected to the wick tabs themselves. So I make a complete normal candle with a wooden wick if I'm doing wooden wick testing. And then if you find out that wooden wick is not the correct one, it's easy to remove that. And then you can insert a wooden wick in the exact same spot and it will sit and nestle down into the wick tab. You can just push it right back down in. So there's no need to do a wickless candle when it comes to wooden wick testing, in my opinion. All that being said, most people are concerned with wickless testing when it comes to cotton wicks because there is no way to really easily replace a wick if that candle that you made, a normal candle, is not the right wick size or wick type. You're really kind of left with having to start all over. What are some of the pros of wickless testing? Well, as I've kind of hinted at them already, there's really two main advantages to wickless testing. The first is potentially less costly. Now I say potentially because of what I'm going to talk about in the next step, but assuming everything goes perfect and there's no problems with your wickless testing, and you even find the correct wick within the first 1 or 2 wicks, then yes, it can definitely save you money. You're making 1 candle as opposed to 4 or 6 candles, and that also means potentially less waste because once again, you're making 1 candle as opposed to 4 or 6 or however many it might take to find the right wick. So yes, for sure, saving money and saving some wasted materials is definitely a potential benefit or pro of using wickless testing. But also potentially third benefit of wickless testing is the fact that it's just easier to track. You don't have 4 or 6 candle testers burning all over your house or your apartment or your warehouse or your shop or wherever you're doing this. You just got one that you have to keep an eye on and you can just easily say, yeah, that's working, or no, it's not, I need to replace it and move on with your day. Tracking 4, 6, or 8 test candles all over can be a little bit difficult sometimes to keep track of if you're not really diligent at documentation. However, all that being said, there is another side of the story, of course, and that is the disadvantages of doing wickless testing. First and most significant disadvantage of wickless testing is the lack of reliability. I find wickless testing not to be reliable or consistent at all. And what is the biggest reason for that? Well, the biggest reason is the fact that those wicks are not secured to the bottom of your jar. So after that candle starts to melt a little bit and the wax starts to soften up, it does not take long before that wick will start moving around because it's not secured and it will start leaning and leaning. And as many of you have probably experienced, you're lucky if you get halfway through the jar before the wick is completely just fallen over into the liquefied or mushy softened wax. At that point, you can no longer really continue wickless testing on that jar because even if you remove that wick, let it harden back up, and put another hole in and insert a new wick and try again, the same thing's going to happen in a couple hours. Once you've kind of reached that point in a jar where the wax is going to be too soft that the wick no longer stands up, then you're kind of done. Which means, for those of you that thought 1 wickless candle is really saving you from making several candles, it's not entirely true. If you haven't found that winning wick on the first or second try, chances are you're left with a half a jar full of wax that you're in the same boat as you were if you made several candles. So wicks that are not secure to the bottom do create issues. And some of them are going to be really, really hard to detect. I can tell you in my own experiences of doing countless wickless testing in the past it's not always really noticeable. You might not see your wick entirely move over, but again, because it's not secured to the bottom, it can actually move just a little bit. And that little bit of moving and shifting in the jar can be enough that that wick is really not sticking out of the wax near as much as it normally would be if it was secured. And so you might think you're underwicked, when in reality, the wick was just folded over or leaning over a little bit too much because it had softened up and was no longer staying taut and in place where it originally was. And I have had many situations where I thought, what is going on with this particular oil? Is it so heavy? Why can't I seem to find the right wick size no matter what wick size I try? Well, the reason is because underneath I couldn't see, but the wick had actually moved too much and it just wasn't staying centered and attached and taut. It wasn't burning like it should be. It was easy to find this out when I made a real candle with a wick actually attached to the bottom and saw completely different results. So for those of you that have been struggling with consistency or reliability on your testing, if you're doing wickless testing, this could be a big reason why. So that is the most critical disadvantage I would say to doing wickless testing. However, that also relates to my next point, which is that wickless testing does not work very well in shallow, wide containers. Why? Because the jar is already shallow or the tin is already shallow, that it's just like the situation I explained where once you're halfway down a jar, the wick will not stay in place. You just can't do wickless testing in tins that are really shallow. Now, some of you are thinking, well, I don't really care in those cases because they're smaller candles in general. It's not as much cost. It's not as much waste. And that's a good point. That is completely fair, and I totally understand that. But the point is still valid. Wickless testing doesn't work in small or shallow containers. And then the last, and in my opinion, also a very significant drawback to doing wickless testing is the amount of time it takes. It is a very timely process, and it takes much longer to do wickless testing than it does standard testing. And in my opinion, time is money. I don't really have the time necessarily to be doing that same process of testing one over and over and over and over. For those of you starting out, you may have that time, and that's completely up to you and your business and your situation. Once you have a lot of other things going, you're juggling a lot of balls in the air, it becomes really difficult to spend the amount of time wickless testing one jar over and over and over, whereas you could simply make 4 candles, put the wicks in that you think are pretty close, and then choose the best one when it's all said and done. Why is this so much faster? Well, besides just being able to do 4 at once versus 1 at a time, the other reason though is because every time you change a wick out doing wickless testing, you have to insert the wick, fill in, remelt and fill in that kind of gap a little bit. Then you have to let that candle solidify again. And there's some time in between each test. Whereas making 4 to 6 candles at a time, as long as you have a relatively decent idea of where to start with a wick, and these days most of us do either through recommendations on suppliers, Facebook groups, YouTube channels. Usually we can start with a rough idea. Time is money, and in my opinion, spending too much time on a process can sometimes or often be worse than spending a few extra dollars up front to get it right the first time. The last disadvantage that I'm going to talk about in this video for wickless testing is actually the opposite of the last advantage. As I mentioned before, one of the pros of wickless testing is that it's easier to track because you're only having to watch 1 candle versus 6 or 8 candles going at a time. Well, the disadvantage by not having several going at a time is it's harder to compare how each wick is doing jar to jar. If you've got 8 testers going, it's very easy to look at them and just visually see which one is performing better. You can definitely do this 1 at a time with a wickless candle by making very detailed notes, snapping pictures, whatever your documentation testing process is. Everyone's got one that's a little bit different or more unique, and it might completely work fine for you doing it that way. But for those starting out, sometimes it's much easier to visually see the difference on how each candle is burning. So that is another advantage, I would say, although maybe not as important one. I would say that is still an advantage to not doing wickless testing or doing standard testing instead. So what are the conclusions and my recommendations? Well, I have to be honest and upfront first, and just let you know that I don't do wickless testing. There are a few reasons for that, but I prefer to make multiple standard candles and test them all together. And not only do I see visual differences, but it's just a much faster process. I can be done testing new wicks in half the time as I can doing a wickless testing. Plus, of course, as I mentioned before, I find it much more reliable. I want to test a candle the exact same way that it will burn when I make a finished product and when a customer is burning the candle as well. If you're curious on some of my testing habits, I will also link up above another video that talks about some testing processes that I've used. Now you can tweak it. It might work for some, it might not work for others. It's just to help kind of kickstart some ideas for you and help you come up with a good testing process that works for you. Now it's a pretty detailed video on ways that I like to go through a testing process. So feel free to check it out and use the same testing process if you want, or like I said, tweak it to how you would like to use it yourself. So now I know some of you right now are thinking, well, what do you do with all those extra wasted testers, the ones that did not pan out? Well, there are a few things you can do with them. One thing, if you need to continue doing further testing, is to simply warm up those jars in whatever method you want to use. Remove the wax from those, combine them into other jars. So if you've got 2 jars that are half full now, you can combine both of those and make another tester. So you're not necessarily wasting wax, although the process to empty out wax, put them together in new jars and reuse the jars can kind of be a daunting process, but it is definitely an option. Another option you can do is to use them for personal use, which is probably what I do the most. Jars that are left over that I can't use for real products or to put on the shelves and sell to customers, I just use around the house. They're not gonna burn perfect. I don't care, it's for my own use. There's no harm in doing that whatsoever. In fact, that way you're never actually digging into your final products, which I find not too bad. The last option that some people do, and I do sometimes myself, is, especially around fall and winter, is you can use that wax, scoop it out in any way you want, and you can make fire starters. Now, I don't have a video on making fire starters yet, although I will do that in the future, but there are other videos out there or blogs out there that might help you learn how to make quick fire starters. They're very easy. There's so many ways you can make them, but the leftover wax makes great use in fire starters. All right, however, if you do decide that wickless testing might still make sense for you, and it will for many, let me offer you a few tips and suggestions if you're going to go down that route. First of all, just keep in mind, as I talked about earlier, it works better for larger jars. the taller the jar, the better wickless testing is going to work because you have a lot more wax to consume before the wick will start moving around on you. So that is definitely something I would do for sure, is utilize wickless testing really only if you're using kind of larger or taller style jars. I would avoid even trying to do it on shallow containers. Also, depending on what type of wax you use, super soft waxes will not work near as well for wickless testing as harder waxes. So if you are someone that uses like a modeling wax or a hard paraffin wax or hard parasoys, you're going to find better results with wickless testing with harder waxes as opposed to very, very soft waxes. Those just get so soft and so mushy and so liquefied so quickly that the wick's just not going to stay put very well, and you'll find it to become very unreliable and very frustrating. And then my last final piece of advice, and this is probably the most important one for anyone that wants to do wickless testing, and that is to verify your results with a real standard test candle. If you think you've got a wick that you liked and performed well in your wickless testing, make another candle the right way, the proper normal way, and burn it from start to finish and make sure that wick actually performs the way you think. Because as I said earlier, in my experience, a lot of my results that I got from wickless testing were not consistent at all with my test from burning standard test candles. So I'm not trying to scare anyone away from doing wickless testing. Just know that if you're going to do it to help kind of lock in a better idea for a wick for you, then make sure you follow it up with verified testing. And one other quick tip, for those of you that don't necessarily want to make a bunch of candles, but also are feeling a little iffy on using a wickless solution, let me give you one little thing you might want to try as well. And that is, you can make your standard candle, but you're going to treat it like a wickless candle. So what do I mean? Take your standard candle, choose whatever wick you think is closest, make your best educated guess, and make a normal candle. And if you find out that wick isn't working, too big, too small, wrong wick type, whatever the reason may be, find yourself an apple core like this one. I will link one in the description of this video. Let me real quick say, if it's a super soft wax, this might not work because it might not get the wax out cleanly. And if it's a super, super hard wax, you might have a hard time getting this in. But the idea is this. Pretend this had a wick already in it and it just wasn't working out. And I want to remove this, but I don't want to just insert part of a wick again and try the whole wickless thing. You want to try an actual wick on a wick tab that is secured to the bottom of the container. You're going to take this, you're going to find basically the center of the jar right around where your wick was, and you're just going to insert it, and this is really hard to show, but you're going to go straight down, okay, and you're going to twist, you're going to pull out the wax, right, and that's going to leave a hole. Now, you might have to do it a couple times to get it all out to the bottom. So why would you do this? Well, once you've got all the wax out using this method, you can then get in there with some pliers and remove the actual wick tab. Once you've got the wick tab removed, try your best to get any debris, the wick sticker removed. Try your best to kind of get down in there and make sure it's a decent surface to stick another wick sticker to. But anyways, once you're done, you're going to take a regular wick and you're going to try to secure it down in the middle. Again, this works sometimes and sometimes it doesn't. You'll just want to experiment and see if it'll work for your jar or your wax. And then you can insert an actual normal wick right back down into the jar, and then you can trust that it's actually secured. It's not just floating around in there, it's secured. What have you done here is you've kind of just made a hybrid between a standard test candle and a wickless candle. So you can still just make one candle. It's a little bit more work to change the wick out, but at least you can test multiple wicks and still only one candle. And it'll be more reliable results. So just a little bonus tip there. I don't even do that myself. I have in the past, but I still do multiple test candles. But the situation is different for everyone. So I want to wrap up this video by just letting you know that I am not trying to deter anyone necessarily from doing wickless testing. Every situation is unique. Something different works for every person. But this is just my experience and my thoughts on wickless testing. I have not found it all that reliable in the past. And to me, time is more important than the few extra dollars I might have wasted making a few extra candles. So that is my opinion on this. And if you do want to continue doing wickless testing, I would recommend following a few of those tips that I gave you, as well as potentially this bonus tip. I hope you all enjoyed this video. Thanks for tuning in as always. Don't forget, if you found this content helpful at all, give this video a like, a quick little thumbs up below. That really helps this channel out. I appreciate you all, and I'll see you next time.